Well, John Brown is a very interesting character. Here was a man who had very long ties to the abolitionist movement. He had been anti-slavery since, as he counts for it, as a young boy, when he had seen some things that were disturbing to him, his family was interested in the movement. But he was also a man who had just spent his entire life sort of searching for things, searching for, I think, his place in the world, and searching for some measure of financial success, which he never achieved. I mean, there were a series of bankruptcies. He, had a lot of difficulty supporting his family. I think he had 20 children. He had a lot of children, but it was close to 20 children if it wasn't 20 children. And so he had to support this very large family, and he found that very difficult. He was not a household name in America before Kansas, but he came out to Kansas, and here was a guy who was willing to fight for what he believed in, and to resort to violence for what he believed in, which was that slaves should immediately be freed in the United States. And most abolitionists in America did not think that way at this point. This was a movement that was a nonviolent movement. They believed that they should morally persuade people, or they called it moral suasion, that they could talk to people and they could reason with people, and they tried to do things like send abolitionist literature into the South, which was very, very quickly suppressed. They sent people out on speaking tours, especially former slaves like Frederick Douglass, of course, was one of the leaders of this movement, and a man named William Wells Brown, who was actually a man who had been enslaved in Missouri. He was a slave in St. Louis, and is a really interesting guy. He finally was able to escape from slavery as a young man, and then became a leading abolitionist. He wrote the first novel by an African American man in American history. He's a really, really interesting guy. But guys like this were going out, and certainly Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, and they were talking to people, as well as a lot of white abolitionists. And they believed, at least initially, that was the way to go, to try to show people that they were wrong, to try to get to really to focus on people in the North, to get more and more people to come over to their side by focusing on what slavery did to families, especially, how it tore mothers from their children, and certainly the abuse that people suffered under slavery. And so that was their way of thinking. And John Brown thought that way as well, except for that he believed that he needed to take action. And so he came out to Kansas with a number of his family members, his grown children, and staked a claim, as did everyone else, but then got very involved in this, in the fight for Kansas to become a free state. And he most famously, at least in Kansas, was involved with what was called the Potawatomi Massacre, where he basically, knocked on, well, he would never admit that he was there, although the people who witnessed what happened said he was there, and we know that his sons, at least 4 of his sons, were there, and some other people, and they basically went from door to door, cabins of pro-slavery people that lived along Potawatomi Creek, and took men out of their homes and hacked them to death with broadswords. And they were not necessarily leaders of the pro-slavery movement. They happened to be Southerners. They didn't even own slaves, many of them. And so but they were a symbol to him, I think, of this movement of people into the state of Kansas. So apparently he did that. His son remembered later, and who knows if this memory is true or not, but he remembered that John Brown was totally incensed when he found out that Charles Sumner, the United States Senator from Massachusetts, had been caned, beaten over the head to, almost to his death by a representative from the state of South Carolina who believed that his uncle who was a senator from South Carolina, his honor had been slighted by Sumner. And if you read the speech that Sumner gave, which is called "The Crime Against Kansas," he really kind of did go after this particular guy in a really over the top way by any measure, I think, if you read it. But whether or not it warranted being beaten over the head, I think probably not. But that's what happened, where this guy came into the Senate chamber where Sumner was working at the end of the day, and just started wailing on him with this gold-tipped cane, and just kept beating him, and Sumner's legs were trapped underneath this Senate desk that was bolted to the ground. And finally he was able to sort of wrestle his way out of the situation by basically ripping the desk from the floor, and people came to his aid, but he couldn't return to the Senate for a couple of years. I mean, he was brain damaged, basically. I mean, he ultimately, he just had a significant head injury, and so he did return to the Senate. But it was a really horrific act, and what was even more interesting about it is the way that people responded to it. So what happened is that the House of Representatives censored essentially Preston Brooks, but then he resigned from his seat. He returned to the state of South Carolina, where he was overwhelmingly elected back to his seat, and he was celebrated throughout the South. People were sending him canes as sort of congratulatory gifts, whereas in the North, people were totally outraged. This is a wonderful political cartoon that talks about, it basically suggests that the Southerners think that the way that they get their way is to bully people and through violence, whereas Northerners think that the way you do things is to talk about it, and that basically Southerners were trying to suppress free speech. And they thought that what happened was totally horrible. And John Brown thought what happened was horrible. And supposedly he heard about this, and that's what set him off and made him decide to go and do this thing at Pottawatomie Creek, coupled with the fact that there had been this incident in Lawrence where the pro-slavery forces, because the legitimate government of the state of Kansas was pro-slavery, and Sam Jones, who was a sheriff, decided that they were going to try to arrest some Free State leaders, basically, and there had been this sort of armed standoff that had happened. Basically, people were armed to the teeth, and there had been a standoff outside of Lawrence. Sam Jones was shot, but not killed, as he was trying to move forward with his plan. And ultimately, sort of in the wake of that, the pro-slavery people went into Lawrence to try to arrest people. They destroyed the the Free State presses, the press in the town. They burned down the hotel, which they thought was an armed arsenal, which it kind of was, and they generally looted and destroyed the town. And so that had happened as well, and all of that sort of set off John Brown. He continued in the territory for some time afterwards, was involved in some different armed actions at the Battle of Blackjack, down near Osawatomie where he lived, but ultimately he left Kansas for a time, and he essentially went east and started meeting with people. And when he got there, as Jonathan Earl describes it, and others, he was a rock star. People thought within abolitionist circles that this was a man of action, and he would come into these, sort of upscale parlors in a place like Boston, dressed in his Western sort of wear, and talk about, and with it, oftentimes with a knife in his, in his belt, and talk about all of what was happening in Kansas, and talk about the armed struggle and how people were actually, fighting for their rights, and people were practically, all these, sort of buttoned up businessmen and attorneys and people who were sympathetic to the abolitionist cause, they were practically giddy listening to him. I mean, he really drew people in. He was very apparently charismatic, and people bought into his vision of things. And a small group of men ended up giving him money for what ultimately was his raid on Harper's Ferry, which is how most people know John Brown, for his 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry, where he tried to take over the federal arsenal there. And his idea was that he was going to distribute the guns to slaves up along the Appalachian Mountains, and that they would, laying a little groundwork, that they would rise up against their owners, and there would be an armed insurrection. So you can imagine how Southerners felt about that was the most horrifying thing that they could imagine, that not only would there be a slave insurrection, but that it would be led by a white man, by an abolitionist from the North. But, John Brown really arrives at these ideas, I think, because of his experience in Kansas. He really sort of cut his teeth on this idea of armed action against slavery here in Kansas. And it made him, it certainly gave him the fame that he desired, and it gave him a platform on which to speak about these things, and it ultimately caused people to give him money to move forward with this action that they probably didn't know all the details about, but they knew that he was planning something big. He does come back to Kansas at one other point before the Harper's Ferry raid, where he raids into Missouri south of here and steals a number of, the Missourians would consider steals a number of slaves. He would say, and I would say, liberates some slaves and takes them over into Kansas, and then helps them up, the so-called Lane Trail, which was a sort of a trail up into Nebraska and over into Iowa, and ultimately to freedom. So he does come back one last time, but his big imprint on Kansas, I think, is in the early years of bleeding Kansas.